Hello, everyone. Today we will review all the major concepts we learned throughout this course, from GDP to unemployment, inflation, economic growth, financial market, and so on. After reviewing the key ideas, we will look at the 2026 US economic outlook published by major economic institutions. This final session ties everything together by showing how economists use the very concepts you learned to assess current economic conditions and predict where the economy is heading. This course has covered the core building blocks of macroeconomics. We started by learning how economists measure economic activity and how the economy behaves both in the short run and the long run. Throughout the lectures, we used the same toolkits again and again, such as GDP, unemployment, inflation, productivity, and financial system and the ADAS model. These concepts help you understand how an economy expands, contracts, and responds to policy, such as fiscal and monetary policy. We also connected the US economy to the global economy by studying trade and exchange rates. What you have learned in this course gives you a complete framework for analyze economic conditions. So let's start with GDP. GDP measures the market value of all final goods and services produced within a country during a specific period. You learned two major ways to calculate GDP. The expenditure approach adds up, consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. The income approach measures the total income earned from producing goods and services. GDP helps us understand both the size of the economy and how production changes over time. Policymakers rely, heavily on GDP to evaluate economic performance and business cycles. Next, we studied unemployment, which measures the share of the labor force that is without work but actively seeking employment. You learned the three main types. Frictional unemployment results from normal job searching and short-term transitions. Structural unemployment arises when workers' skills no longer match job requirements. Cyclical unemployment occurs during economic downturns. The natural rate of unemployment consists of frictional and structural unemployment and represent the level the economy normally returns to. The unemployment rate is a key indicator of labor market health and helps us identify economic risks. Then we learned about inflation, which is the sustained increase in the overall price level. Economists measure inflation using indexes such as CPI, PPI, and GDP deflator. You learned about core inflation, which removes the volatile categories like food and energy to give a clearer picture of the long-term trends. Inflation matters because it reduces, purchase power, influences interest rates, and affects savings and investment decisions. Keeping inflation low and stable is one of the Federal Reserve's main responsibilities. Also, we studied long-run economic growth, which refers to increase in real GDP over time. Growth is driven by productivity improvements, human capital development, technological innovation, capital deepening, and strong institutional foundation, such as property rights and financial stability. Economic growth is crucial because it raises living standards and expands an economy's capacity to produce goods and services. Countries that invest in education, innovation, and infrastructure tend to experience faster long-term growth. We also looked at financial markets, which act as the bridge between savers and borrowers. Financial markets channel savings into productive investment, determine interest rate through supply and demand for lower funds, and allow risk to be shared across lenders and borrowers. We examined how banks operate, how the Federal Reserve regulates the financial system, and how credit expansion influences economic activity. These markets play a central role in supporting growth, investment, and monetary policy. And we use the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model to understand fluctuations in the economy. This model helps us, analyze recession, expansion, and inflationary pressures by examining how total supply from firms interacts with the total spending from households, businesses, the governments, and foreign buyers. The ADAS model also allows us to evaluate fiscal and monetary policy. For example, shifts in aggregate demand explains how government spending or Federal Reserve interest rate decisions influence the short-term economy. The last week, we focused on global economy. We studied exchange rates, the price of one currency in terms of another, and how currency appreciation and depreciation affect imports and exports and investment flows. We also explored, you know, international trade, including concepts like absolute and competitive advantage, intra-industry trade, and global value chain. These topics show how deeply interconnected economies are and why international markets matter for domestic economic conditions. With these concepts, economists predict the next economic performance. An economic outlook is a forecast of future economic conditions based on data, trends, and economic models. Organizations that produce outlooks analyze expected GDP growth, unemployment trends, inflation forecast, interest rate path, and potential global risk. These reports are typically published quarterly or annually. Economic outlooks play an important role in guiding business decisions, government planning, and public expectations because they offer a forward-looking view of economic health. Many major institutions publish economic outlooks. The International Monetary Fund and the OECD produce the global and country-level forecast. Within the United States, the Federal Reserve regularly releases its FOMC projections, and the Congressional Budget Office, provides the long-range budget and economic forecasts. And the World Bank also published global economic assessments. In addition, major financial firms such as Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan issued their own outlooks to guide investors. These organizations combine data analysis, econometric modeling, and expert judgment to predict future economic performance. According to the February projections from the Congressional Budget Office and the International Monetary Fund, the US economy is expected to grow at a little above 2% in 2026. Both institutions anticipate a solid labor market, with the unemployment rates in a 4% range. Inflation is expected to moderate but remain slightly above the Federal Reserve 2% target. However, both the IMF and CBO highlights that rising the US federal debt poses a long-term risk to fiscal sustainability. The table compares specific projections from the two institutions, showing their expectations for, you know, GDP growth, inflation, and unemployment. Okay, thank you for your hard work throughout the course.